I'm Ben Sachs. I am the Jewish scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, and we're thrilled that you're here today to learn from Dr. Rachel Mikva. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover a number of topic areas. The book, which I just received, although I got to read in another form, is called Dangerous Religious Ideas, The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we're going to talk about what those dangerous ideas are today. We're also going to talk about what the deep roots of self-critical faith are. We're going to talk about the role of religion in the public square. And of course, we're going to talk about what has occurred in the last, maybe the longest time between two Tuesdays, at least in my lifetime. But Dr. Mikva will reflect on our current political and religious moment and how her work can help us at least make better sense of the overall political landscape, but also hopefully give us hope on how to best move forward. So with that in mind, I'd like to share a little bit about the person with whom we're meeting today. So Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva serves as the Herman E. Schallman Chair in Jewish Studies and Senior Faculty Fellow of the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary. The Institute and the seminary work at the cutting edge of theological education, training religious leaders who can build bridges across cultural and religious difference for the critical work of social transformation. Dr. Mikva has published on a wide variety of areas. Of course, her newest book, Dangerous Religious Ideas, The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was released a week ago, appropriately enough, on Election Day. She is also author of Broken Tablets, Restoring the Ten Commandments and Ourselves, and Midrash V'Yosha, a medieval midrash on the Song of the Sea, as well as a variety of articles on biblical interpretation, social justice, and interreligious engagement. Her next book project is a textbook for undergraduate and graduate courses in interreligious studies and engagement. And to remind some of you who've been here before, and for those of us joining us now, the ICJS is an organization that builds learning communities, that sees religious difference as a powerful force for good, and that these learning communities are essential to some way crossing our differences, learning from our differences, but also building better communities together. So now that we have an introduction, I'd love to start our conversation. And so Rachel, do you mind just sharing with us a few things before we really get started? Just a basic summary of the arguments in your book, standing on one foot, your elevator speech. But also, I think something that we're also very interested in is, how did you come to the topic? What motivated you to write the book, to think about these issues, and to research it and share your wisdom?
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with the community today. It's always a treat to work with you all. And although we can't be in the same room, I'm appreciative of getting a conversational kind of program. And Rachel is fine, by the way. I mean, I like all my titles. I'm very proud of them all, but Rachel's also fine. So I teach and speak a lot in religious communities, and I kept bumping into two assumptions. In progressive spaces, people often imagined that they had already reformed their traditions enough so that their ideas were never dangerous, never did any harm. And then in more traditional spaces, I found that people often worried that even asking critical questions would somehow weaken faith. So I wanted people to re-examine these assumptions, to see the deep roots of self-critical faith that are designed to strengthen faith and improve it, and to recognize that this work is never done. The minute we assume that all the dangers of religion belong to somebody else's ideas, somebody else's faith, we become part of the problem. So first I taught a course, and now I've written this book arguing that all religious ideas are dangerous. Not only those that we might consider extremist, but even those we embrace, and even those that stand at the heart of faith. And because most religious traditions have always understood this peril, they've transmitted tools of self-critique as essential dimensions of faith. The seeds for this work have been planted deep in the soil of religious thought, and they're designed for us to cultivate. So if we want religion to be a force for blessing in the world, which it surely has been and can be, this is the work we have to do.
Thank you. And just to think about the religious ideas for a moment, I was struck by just the tempestuous relationship between these ideas that can redeem and also to alienate. But a question that we had at the ICJS was what made religious ideas different from, say, political, philosophical, aesthetic, in such a way that the danger embedded in those ideas are not as dangerous as religious ideas? That there's something about a religious idea that it's somehow is more dangerous than the others.
I'm not sure that I make a comparative argument. I feel particularly responsible for the religious dimensions as a leader and teacher in religious communities. But I think it's easier to answer that part of the question if I do flesh out for folks who haven't seen the book a few of those dialectical, the idea, a religious idea that can be very powerfully good, but also do harm. So I very briefly touch in the book on God as an example. I'm not talking about people who kill each other because they think somebody else has the wrong God. I'm talking about the fact that over 40% of Americans think that you have to believe in God in order to be an ethical person. So if we don't trust each other based on what we believe about God, about divinity, that's dangerous for the fabric of our society and for our coexistence. The three themes I teach, I treat in the book at greater length are scripture. So is it a sacred call to advance justice and mercy amidst God's creation? Or is it a selectively read authorization to vindicate our worldview and marginalize people with whom we disagree? Or the theme of chosenness and election, is it an aspirational covenant to become worthy of God's blessing and an extension of it in this world? Is it faith in God's abiding love and grace? Or does it serve as a claim of superiority and exclusivity? And I also look at reward and punishment, which can be seen to enact some measure of justice, discern meaning in suffering, but also encourage retribution and blame victims for their plight. So these ideas, right, are they A or B? They're both. And the things that they have meant have mattered. And it's the first part of the book is to say religion is also a force for good. But I compare it with fire, like something that in its variety of forms is responsible for great blessing, something we can't imagine our world without, but something that's also capable of great harm. And it's not always the action of a sociopath. Most of the time it's an accident, a byproduct. Sometimes it's something that we know there's harm being done, but we think it's justified or necessary. So the dangers of religion include not only the justification of violence, but also emotional harm, psychological harm, social harm. They can jump out of the book, a sacred text, out of the pulpit, out of the street, out of the home. They can also linger discreetly in symbols and music, rituals, metaphors. It's also important to recognize that dangers aren't universally perceived and that sometimes they can be desirable. My favorite example is the Jubilee. It would be terribly disruptive to the economy to redistribute wealth every 50 years. But the commitment that there won't be a permanent underclass, that's a really important, desirable, dangerous religious idea, that we can imagine the world different than it is. So all kinds of ideas fall into this dialectical tension of danger and possibility. When embedded in religion, now we're finally getting to your question, I think that there are several critical dynamics that emerge. One is a sense of ultimacy, because religious ideas have the capacity to override other criteria that we might have for what is just or what is good or what is true, right? It has sometimes led people to deny evidence of countervailing ideas. A second thing that happens when we're talking about religious ideas is that we have to recognize religion is woven through every aspect of our psyche and society. So it magnifies the power and presence and impact of the ideas in many ways. So when I mean when I say it's woven through every part of us, right? We can think about psychological needs that religion addresses, our will to pleasure, our will to power, our will to meaning. We can think about the role of religion in creating human communities, the role of religion as custodians of cultural values. It's even, embedded into our DNA and evolutionary neurological development. So that's a second dynamic, is sort of the pervasiveness, the scope. And the third dynamic that I think is particular to religious ideas is that in the public square, they generally get a pass.
So you write in relation to that, one of the hallmarks of successful, and you put in quotes successful. I don't know if you remember that, but page 100. Successful scriptural religions is a hermeneutic that makes the text eternally relevant. And so the images become archetypal in our religious imagination. And you also say that every interpretation is arguably political. And so there seems to be a tension between what you draw out of a text and what you put into a text. That there's always this relationship between what you want to see and what, as we say in the Jewish tradition, the pshat, the simple meaning is. There's this battle between eisegesis and exegesis. Is that the place where we're going to find self-critical engagement? Or do we find that somewhere else in the self-critical faith?
So because the first unit that I work through is scripture, because scripture serves as the foundation for so much of the religions that I know something about, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I do deal with I think we have to grapple with what is the human role, or Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza has a great way of framing it. She says, what is the script and what's the scripture, right? What's the part that we've written and what does God really think? And that dynamic comes into play whether or not we embrace textual critical thinking about scripture, that these are human documents, or we believe that the text is in fact revealed verbatim from the divine. The traditions recognized long before the rise of historical critical thought that the human role in interpreting these texts is enormous, and we have to recognize it and name it. So the sort of pre-modern tools for thinking about the role of scripture, and you can find this in all three traditions, you have a recognition of multiplicity, multivocality, both in the text and in interpretations of the text. You have grappling with because the human interpretive component is inextricable, whether we think it's eisegesis or exegesis, whether we know we're putting ourselves into the text or trying to pull out what is the text really trying to say. We can't completely separate ourselves out of that exercise. So because of that, all kinds of human limitations become important. We have a limited capacity to perceive the truth. We need to recognize what I like to call epistemological humility, right? We just have to be humble about what we think we know and how we think we know it. And they even grapple with what is the nature of truth, right? Are these absolute truths? Are they truths to live by? And how do we know this? Are key questions that exist through the whole history of interpretation. Did that get at what you were trying to ask?
Well, those are the deep roots, it sounds like. And
some of them.
And so I think what we would be curious to learn is how those deep roots surface in interreligious dialogue. How do we become more self-critically aware of our own tradition in a way that makes us more honest about this really complicated relationship between sacred traditions and sacred authorities that are dedicated to us in our religious tradition, but somehow we are open to others. It would be helpful to know how these deep roots in each of our religious traditions help us become better dialogue partners. And also, because this is anticipating the next question, how we become better public interlocutors when it comes to how we want to advocate in society or build in society.
Those are great questions. So basically I'm hearing, what is self-critical faith and how do we do it? And I think that there are maybe 4 key things we need to recognize in the exercise of self-critical faith. One is how the power to heal is bound up with the power to harm. So let's stick with the example of scripture. Again, this abiding relevance, the capacity for it to shape our lives, to call us to advance justice and mercy amidst God's creation. But as long as there's scripture, people are going to wield the word against one another to justify their own worldview. Not only do we think you're wrong, God says you're wrong. We'll also need to reckon with the painful silences of voices that are left out of the canon. And we have to recognize that the othering that was done in the text that was grounded in a particular historical context. There's actually a part of the New Atheist critique that gives me pause. Now, most of the New Atheists are not experts in religion, and so the critique of religion is pretty clumsy. But one of the things they do is they lump sort of extremists in with everybody else. And David Hollinger asks it this way. He says, can't they tell Methodists from morons? Is provocative, but kind of a lovely turn of the phrase. And the fact that the critique is that no matter how wonderful our religious ideas are, we're actually helping to sustain a multi-headed hydra. Some of those heads spit venomous things out, right? So if we as progressive religionists, as pluralists, as people who believe religion can be a force for blessing, but we're sustaining this big thing called religion, we're also sustaining its ongoing power to do harm as well. Now, I don't think religion is separable from human existence, so I don't think we have an option, but I think we need to be self-critical about that. So number 1, recognize the power to heal is bound up with the power to harm. And the more powerfully it can do one, it can do the other. The second is to recognize that the dark or dangerous side of faith cannot always be attached to somebody else. So I'll speak as a religious progressive here. Progressive commitments to gender equality. They can strip women in traditional communities of their agency. And often unwittingly, we participate in critiques that were shaped by the legacy of colonialism. So I'm not going to forfeit my commitment to gender equality, but I have to recognize that in some ways, there's a dangerous and dark side of what goes on in my heart and spirit as well. And not a dark side, a potential for hurt. My own commitment to pluralism leads me to easily denigrate or dismiss those who are certain that they have exclusive and supreme grasp on God's own truth. I have an evangelical Christian colleague who said to me once, we can't always be the problem that needs to be solved rather than the person with whom you built relationship. It wasn't a personal critique, it was sort of a general thing about interreligious engagement. And another piece I would say as progressive religionists or pluralists is that we carry a lot of baggage, residue that we don't even recognize a lot of times. Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer has a nice piece she wrote a while ago about how this happens with her around chosenness. She thinks she's sort of purged all the dangerous aspects of it, but she finds things sort of creeping in. I run into it more often with my students as they're surprised how much of the New Testament's anti-Pharisaic polemic they've absorbed and how it shapes their understanding of Judaism. Again, even though they know better, they catch themselves denigrating the law as contrary to the spirit, or suggesting that Judaism was too parochial, so Paul invents universalism, like Al Gore invented the internet. A third aspect of self-critical faith that I think is important, and this is why I do the book the way I do it, is to recognize and activate the self-critical roots, the capacities of our traditions. This is not some tool of secularism that's bent on destroying religion, but rather it's built into our spiritual inheritance. So, and the fourth is that we need to recognize that this exercise makes our faith stronger. There are too many people stuck with a pediatric introduction to their religion, which is really not adequate to complexity of living as an adult in the world. And the idea of treating faith as fragile, as unable to withstand tough questions, doesn't allow it to develop, so our spiritual muscles can atrophy. So these are part of our spiritual inheritance to improve the religious project. So I would say those four recognitions, that it makes our faith grow stronger, that we have these self-critical capacities in our tradition, that the dangers aren't always somebody else's, and that the power to heal is always bound up with the power to harm. I think those are the foundations for self-critical faith.
So I just want to tell everyone in who's listening, you still need to buy and read the book. Rabbi Dr. Mikva has summed this up very beautifully. And I feel like we should all be so gifted to be able to take a very complex argument and put it down into 5 minutes. But you still are required to read the book, and I will be following up with each of you. That's an empty threat since I don't know who's on, who's here. I can look at lists. But moving into the public square, you talk about how religious speech in the U.S. context is protected but not privileged, and that's kind of essential to the self-critical evaluation of our own tradition and others when trying to build a pluralistic society. Do you mind talking to us about how that's done and why the protected but not privileged category is essential to this self-critical work in the public square?
Sure. I'll work through a little bit of what I worked through in the book again, and then I'll mention a case that I think is key. No, not key. It's emblematic of what's going on and of this tension around this question. So I was raised in the tradition of John Rawls. Depending on how old you are, maybe you were too. I'm not talking to you, Ben. I'm talking to everybody that I can't see either. I know how old you are. So
the answer is yes, I was too.
Yes. So believing that we should utilize public reason rather than religious beliefs in arguing a policy position. The rules that regulate our common life should be based on the arguments to which we all have equal access. So for much of my life, progressives seem to cede the CEDE, not SEED, the public religious voice. It was not for lack of religious commitment, but rather this liberal commitment to pluralism and Rawlsian public reason. It was a very influential way of thinking about religion in the public square. But unfortunately, it gave the erroneous impressions that political liberalism was hostile to religion, that religious voices were somehow being pushed out of public debate. You couldn't bring your whole self into the public square, and that religious increasingly meant conservative. So as a religious and political progressive, I don't want to relinquish the public voice of religion to people who use it to deny individuals access to public services, or reject climate science, or legislate bias, or limit our responsibilities to support the disadvantaged. At the same time, the separation of religion and state serves a vital role in preserving American democracy and creating this broad space for spirituality to flourish in all of its polymorphous beauty. So, and I'll add that as a religious minority, I'm deeply grateful for the disestablishment of Protestantism, still in process, by the way, concerned that legally privileged religious voices impinge on the liberty of others. So keeping religion out of state affairs and government control out of religion, it fosters the vitality of religious life. It's not just good for democracy, it's good for religion. The controversy is how we talk about and enshrine and embody religious values in our collective public life. So ultimately, I advocate a conversation model rather than strict separation. A conversation, and here's the key, and this is what you were getting at, in which religious ideas are critically engaged. They're way too important to give them a pass. So self-critical faith in the public square, or critically engaged ideas in the public square, goes in at least two directions. It means the ideas we bring in, we need to be able to reflect self-critically on them. It also means civil debate about other people's religious ideas, and that, of course, is a little trickier. One of my favorite examples, one that I bring in the book, is Diana Eck, who takes on the Southern Baptists when they publish a pamphlet about Hinduism that basically says they're all, people who follow the Hindu tradition are all lost in deep darkness. And she says, as a scholar of Hinduism, I think you've seriously misrepresented the Hindu tradition. And I'd be happy to speak with you about where I think you've done that, where it's misleading. As an American and fellow citizen, I'm going to defend your right to believe and practice Christianity as you do, and to believe the worst about your neighbors if you want to, and to say so publicly and privately. But as a Christian, she says, let me challenge you, because I believe that your views of our neighbors aren't well grounded in the gospel of Christ as I understand it. So she speaks from her tradition rather than for it. She brings her expertise and challenges them, but doesn't denigrate and demonize them. Kathleen Cavani offers the language I kind of like of distinguishing condemn and contemn, right? You can feel passionately that something's wrong without demonstrating contempt. And that's definitely something we've lost in the public square. Another example, one I don't bring in the book, is I've been following Rob Schenck, who was an evangelical leader. He's got a blog. With his brother, he really began the anti-abortion movement a long time ago. But periodically in the blog, in this election season, he's been talking about where he thinks evangelical Christianity went wrong. And he talks about, this is the self-critical piece, right? He's lost sight of the welfare of pregnant women, and lost sight of the greatest commandments as Jesus teaches, of borrowing from Torah, of loving God and loving neighbor. and that he's lost sight of all the things that would be required to be pro-life, including life beyond the womb. And that he got caught up in the culture wars and in the rightness of his cause and in the glorification of his own reputation. It's a brutally honest, deeply self-reflective, really interesting piece if you want to check out his blog. And he feels like he helped to birth a movement that evidently now is not pursuing the common good, and that they've abandoned all of their other commitments. He still believes fetal life should be protected, but not at the expense of women. And he even explored what Judaism, which he recognizes as the faith of Jesus, at least at a certain stage of Judaism, right? What it says about the beginnings of life, which do not see humanity being birthed at conception. Distinguish between a born human and a fetus. So when he puts that self-critical piece into the public square, of course, it also implicates other people's ideas. So ultimately, I think what we need to do, and I use Robert Audi's, scholars always make up complicated names for things. He calls it theoethical equilibrium. Basically, where religious considerations appropriately bear on a matter of public policy or political choice, religious people have an obligation to seek an equilibrium between the considerations of our own tradition and relevant secular standards of ethics and political responsibility. So it's not translation a la Rawls. It's balancing what my religion teaches with a plural understanding of the broader public good. I have to stand both inside and outside my life stance and see its impact. And that requires self-critical faith and a commitment to the common good in a diverse society.
So you've hinted at this, but would you mind, I'll pause, but the last week has been an incredibly long week. I know that the joke was that Tuesday lasted forever, but there's something about that anxiety that created this extension of time that showed the urgency of the moment. So in that week, can you give us a sense of where you think we are in terms of our collective need for self-critical faith? And moving forward, how are we going to reconcile some of these differences that created that really tense moment, a fearful moment, that if, regardless of what your political perspective is, if you lost the election, you felt like you lost an aspect of yourself and even your religious point of view, because religious points of view are upholding both candidates in ways that seemed almost irreconcilable. But there are a lot of people that support both of these things, and we have to move forward in some way that respects these differences the way that you're describing, but also creates a place for the integrity of difference in a way that probably none of us really are doing well.
So, it's hard to tease out the religious components of the election. I offered to a journal that I would write a kind of reflection piece on what has been the religious role in 2020. So it'd be partly around election and partly around pandemic. And it's kind of a mixed report card. But I think you're right, absolutely, that our religious values have been deeply impactful in the way we think about what's unfolded in this election and the candidates that we choose to support, and therefore the tools that religions have to help us figure out how to live into our deepest commitments and values at the same time that we create a healthy public space for people whose values are different, whose beliefs and values are different, is, I mean, you can only hope that we bring some of those tools into the sphere. I think one thing that we can recognize is increasing complexity and difference inside many communities. So there's been a tendency, of course, to sort of assume that all white evangelical Christians, not all of them, but in huge numbers, were supporting Donald Trump and enabling all kinds of policies that should theoretically be against their values. And that critique, I think, is in this commitment I have to critiquing religious ideas in the public square, I think it's a fair thing to call evangelical supporters of Donald Trump on. And I think what is coming out is that other white evangelicals were starting to do that. There's a large generational shift inside the evangelical community around issues as well as candidates. So younger evangelicals much more supportive of squarely addressing the climate crisis. And of saying, well, you taught us to follow the model of Jesus around, these things, so their commitments around anti-racism work and other things are different than some of their older white evangelicals. So I think I'm getting a little off track, but what I'm trying to say is that if we can recognize the differences within communities, right, which is always something that interreligious space we're working to do, right, not to meet one Muslim and say, oh, now that person represents and speaks for all of Islam, but to recognize intra-faith diversity. I think if we do that, then we can move toward listening to one another rather than sort of lumping people into categories and demonizing people who we decide are other. But navigating otherness is something that religions really struggle with. It's the longest section in my book. And we're never going to be done with that struggle. And I think in some ways it's now easier, at least this is true in my context, it might be true in yours as well. It's easier to navigate religious difference than political difference. It's almost as if politics have now become the ultimate concern, in Paul Tillich's words. And this is where we have a hard time recognizing the humanity and decency of others. Origen, back in the 3rd century, talked about heresy. And we have certain associations with heresy now, but heresy from the Greek just means choice. And he was basically saying, can you meet people who believe something profoundly different than you and believe that generally they believe it because they also want to advance the public good, right? Can we listen to understand how that could be so?
So we have some questions coming in.
I forgot. I'm sorry. I forgot to mention the case I said I'd mention.
Oh, go ahead.
Should I do that now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So some of you may have followed last week, Fulton v. Philadelphia, the Catholic charities, Catholic Social Services, Catholic Social Services wants to keep its city contract for foster care, even though it won't certify same-sex couples as foster parents. So we were talking about protected but not privileged was your question, and I was going to lift up this case. It's a great example of this tension. So I would argue that they're entitled to believe that parents should be a heterosexual couple. That's their religious freedom. But they need to seek an equilibrium between their religious convictions and the public interest in non-discrimination. And obviously the public interest in foster children who need loving homes, and there are never enough qualified loving homes. So I would argue that their claim does not advance the freedom of religion, rather it enshrines the freedom to discriminate. It would exempt religious agencies that receive taxpayer funding from laws designed to protect minorities and marginalized individuals. It would allow them to turn away people who don't abide by their agency's religious values. So that's the tension between, do we privilege the religious commitment above all of these other commitments, or do we simply protect it and say, this is your freedom, but how do you now wield it in the public square in a way that doesn't privilege it above everything? And luckily, we have a court system to try to navigate it. I don't think it's going to be perfect. The circuit and appellate levels supported Philadelphia in ending the contract. I think the Supreme Court is going to reverse them and uphold the claim of the Catholic Social Services. I would much rather see them talk to each other and work it out, right? I think that the nuanced equilibrium that we're looking for really needs to be in direct engagement.
Thank you. So our first question from the audience is, let's talk a bit about American civic religion. To what end do you see such regularly used phrases as "God bless America" and "In God we trust" as potentially dangerous? Do you think American civic or civil religion has the capacity to be self-critical, at least in the way that you describe in your book?
So I talk about American exceptionalism. And of course, the odd thing about American exceptionalism is that it's not so exceptional. Most nations have this self-image. And recognize that aspects of nationalism can emulate or perform the same kinds of dangerous, transcendent actions that religion can. Connor Cruz O'Brien at one point says that it's more dangerous because it's like chosen people with tenure, right? That nations don't have that same self-critical capacity. And I think that, like religion, we don't always show it, but it is there. Right? There are certainly many voices in the history of American civil religion, invocations of scripture and God on our side, et cetera, that have demonstrated critical self-reflection, right? Lincoln talking about the almost chosen nation. But we have so many examples where we just assume God is on our side and we take and do what we want. Another good example of a self-critical patriotism would be, Langston Hughes, "Let America be America." But I think that there are many uses of religion that are both civil religion, which are the kinds of things that perhaps you were talking about, but also iconographic uses of religious symbols for political and sometimes sectarian purposes. So what does it mean? Well, here's some examples I bring in the book. What does it mean when you bring a Torah scroll to a protest march? That's not civil religion. That's an iconographic use of saying, I think this text agrees with this cause, and I march with it. What does it mean to build the Bible Museum, basically on Capitol Hill? You're basically saying, and this is closer to civil religion, America is a Judeo-Christian, and I don't think that's really a thing, so I put it in scare quotes, a Judeo-Christian nation founded on the Bible, on the values of the Bible. I just lost sight of the end part of the question. The question part of the question.
Oh, are we able in this American civil religion to be self-critical, like of statements like "God bless America" as potentially dangerous, the Bible Museum as potentially dangerous because of because of how embedded it is in our everyday society, our language, our culture. Because of all of those things, are we capable of that level of self-criticism to prevent the danger from actually coming to fruition?
No, I don't think that we ever can totally prevent it. But I think that, and I think that certain things, like religion, the change in the civil religion is hard. So we can be more self-critical about new things than we can about established things. So, under God wasn't always in the Pledge of Allegiance, but try to take it out now. And you would get all kinds of people who were certain that this is a secular attack to undermine religious values and faith in America. So I think that what we can do is shine a light on something and ask people to be aware, right? So what does it mean for some people who might not believe in God to have to recite this as children growing up in school? Can we ask this question without, can we look at the values-based conversation rather than the policy one, right? So rather than arguing whether or not you take it out, can we talk about what it means to have it in, right? It's there. So what does it mean for these students and for these students? And how do we help make it, the classroom a safe place for everybody kind of questions. So yes, I think the work can be done is the short answer, but it will never be done. It will never be finished.
Right. Quoting right from the Mishnah, that the work is never done.
Right? You are not obliged to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it.
So another question, and this is a sensitive one, wanting to know how we can offer these critiques interreligiously without because there are some people who are very free with their criticism of other religions that sort of spill into Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. Like, how do we critique other religions in such a way that it's still in solidarity and it's still in a place of respect, but yet trying to find some sort of pluralistic balance between us? Because that seems to be a very sensitive issue, and at least from this particular audience question, it wanting to do that work together, but recognizing the dangers of it.
Absolutely. And I don't want to pretend to minimize those dangers, especially for religions that have been minoritized in this country and marginalized in this country. It's easier for people who hold power in interreligious space to admit the dark stuff than it is for people who are still under siege in interreligious space or in the broader context. So even the self-critical dimension, much less the outwardly critical or the otherly critical dimension, is complicated in a religious space. I tell one short story in the book about an interreligious effort to take the just peace practices that came out of the Protestant world and do it in interreligious space with Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars. And they kept bumping, they just hitting their heads against the wall, and they couldn't really get there because basically everybody was saying, but our religions are religions of peace and love and goodness. What do we need to talk about this stuff for? And finally, they hit upon a strategy where everybody would bring their worst text, right? The one that demonstrates the capacity of their tradition, their scripture, to advocate violence and othering. And so they did that, and it was like a huge doorway open before them to do the work, because nobody had to say, well, you guys, have brutally attacked us, and because they'd already said it themselves. And so there is something liberative about it at the same time that it is fraught. I would say that to do this work well, we need to focus on two things. One is becoming a lot more interreligiously literate than we are. Because I think rather than saying this is what's wrong with your religion, first of all, I think the most effective critique is intra-faith, right? This is why I lift up an evangelical scholar, right, like Rob Schenck, or an evangelical pastor like Rob Schenck, who is talking to his community, right? As opposed to me critiquing evangelical Christianity. At the same time, though, when I do, I mean, we have an interreligious student body, and we have a strong set of progressive commitments. So when I'm trying to, open up the possibility of perhaps being, recognizing that LGBTQ identified individuals don't need to be as religiously condemned as they tend to be in certain quarters, I will take from teachers inside the tradition to say, is this another way that you could see looking at it? This also comes from your tradition. So rather than saying you are, anti-LGBTQ and that's oppressive and whatever, I say, well, here's another voice inside your tradition. What do you think about that? And I think that's a constructive way to engage critique. And I think the other one is to, much simpler, ask questions, right? The first goal of interreligious work is to understand why somebody believes what they do. And sometimes that opens up a possibility for change and for self-critical analysis.
So we have time for one more question. This one is coming in. What is your scholarly opinion of this quote from a Methodist pastor to his congregation during election week? And here's the quote coming from the pastor. Just remember, the eagle does not fly higher than the cross. Is this a dangerous religious idea? Is this a healing religious idea? Is this pastor working in the service of your work, or is this pastor doing something else? Based on this short quote, yeah.
Right, it's a great quote, of course, now out of context, and it requires interpretation, like scripture does, right? So my understanding of that quote is the eagle representing the nation, and ultimately it could be understood, depending on context, to say you can't forfeit your religious values to advance your political purposes, right? We know that religion gets used for its capacity to motivate and mobilize, and we don't want religion to be used in that way for political purposes. We want to try to ground our decisions in religious values. So you could read it that way. You could also say, depending on if there was a particular issue that the pastor was advocating on religious grounds, it doesn't matter whether or not it's good for the country, it's what our religion teaches, right? You could interpret it that way or apply it that way. So I think it's a perfect example of the problem that I'm laying out, which is that it will always be an existential bundle of both. And we have to talk together and walk together to try to find our way to that balance that tries to hold our religious values inside a diverse society in a way that advances the common good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. These are great questions.
Rabbi Mikva. I want to end on Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, but at that moment, feeling a sense of Rabbi Mikva. Again, I want to remind everyone that the book is now on sale. And if this didn't encourage you to read it, I don't know what else will, but we're moving forward. Interreligious dialogue is essential. And I can't thank Rachel enough for this wonderful event. We're really grateful that you were able to take some time out of your day to teach us and give us an opportunity to learn with you.